Good. Microsoft AZ-104 exam updated questions are online for all Microsoft candidates to study. 1. You need to define a custom domain name for Azure AD to support the planned infrastructure. Which domain name should you use? A. Join the client computers in the Miami office to Azure AD. B. At http://autologon.microsoftazure-ad-so.com to the intranet zone of each client computer in the Miami office. C. Allow inbound TCP port 8080 to the domain controllers in the Miami office. D. Install Azure AD Connect on a server in the Miami office and enable pass-through authentication. E. Install the Active Directory Federation Services ADFS role on a domain controller in the Miami office. 2. You need to meet the user requirement for Admin 1. What should you do? A. From the Subscriptions blade, select the subscription, and then modify the properties. B. From the Subscriptions blade, select the subscription, and then modify the access control (IAM) settings. C. From the Azure Active Directory blade, modify the properties. D. From the Azure Active Directory blade, modify the groups. 3. You need to recommend and identify solution that meets the technical requirements. What should you recommend? A. Federated Single on SSO, and Active Directory Federation Services ADFS. B. Password hash synchronization and single sign-on SSO. C. Cloud-only user accounts. D. Pass-through authentication and single sign-on SSO. 4. You are planning the move of App 1 to Azure. You create a Network Security Group NSG. You need to recommend a solution to provide users with access to App 1. What should you recommend? A. Create an outgoing security rule for port 443 from the Internet. Associate the NSG to all the subnets. B. Create an incoming security rule for port 443 from the Internet. Associate the NSG to all the subnets. C. Create an incoming security rule for port 443 from the Internet. Associate the NSG to the subnet that contains the web servers. D. Create an outgoing security rule for port 443 from the Internet. Associate the NSG to the subnet that contains the web servers. 5. You need to move the blueprint files to Azure. What should you do? A. Generate a shared access signature SAS. Map a drive, and then copy the files by using File Explorer. B. Use the Azure Import/Export service. C. Generate an access key. Map a drive, and then copy the files by using File Explorer. D. Use Azure Storage Explorer to copy the files. 6. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. You have 5 terabytes of data that you need to transfer to Subscription 1. You plan to use an Azure Import/Export job. What can you use as the destination of the imported data? A. Azure Data Lake Store. B. A virtual machine. C. The Azure File Sync Storage Sync Service. D. Azure Blob Storage. 7. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, tenant named Contoso.com and an Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS, cluster named AKS1. An administrator reports that she is unable to grant access to AKS1 to the users in Contoso.com. You need to ensure that access to AKS1 can be granted to the Contoso.com users. What should you do first? A. From Contoso.com, modify the organization relationship settings. B. From Contoso.com, create an OAuth 2.0 authorization endpoint. C. Recreate AKS1. D. From AKS1, create a namespace. 8. You have an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD tenant named ContosoCloud. On Microsoft.com. Your company has a public DNS zone for Contoso.com. You add Contoso.com as a custom domain name to Azure AD. You need to ensure that Azure can verify the domain name. Which type of DNS record should you create? A. PTR. B. MX. C. NSEC3. D. RRSIG. 9. You have an Azure subscription that contains a web app named WebApp1. You need to add a custom domain named www.contoso.com to WebApp1. What should you do first? A. Upload a certificate. B. Add a connection string. C. Stop WebApp1. D. Create a DNS record. 10. You plan to use the Azure Import/Export service to copy files to a storage account. Which two files should you create before you prepare the drives for the import job? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. An XML manifest file. B. A DriveSet CSV file. C. A dataset CSV file. D. A PowerShell PS1 file. E. A JSON configuration file.